Information is basically free now, or at least that's the assumption I've been operating under for a while, and it's one of those ideas that feels so obviously true in daily use that you stop interrogating it altogether. You open your phone, type something half-formed, and within a few seconds, you get an answer that sounds complete enough to move on from, even if you don't fully trust it. And over time, that becomes the default experience of interacting with knowledge. Fast, accessible, and just reliable enough that the gaps don't slow you down. And it's not just search anymore, it's everything layered on top of it. Summaries of things you didn't read, explanations of things you didn't have context for, systems that compress complexity into something you can skim in a few seconds and feel like you've kept up. So the conclusion kind of forms quietly in the background without you really deciding on it. Information is free now, or close enough that it feels the same most of the time. But I started noticing something that didn't quite fit that idea. And it came from a habit that didn't feel important at first, which was checking Polymarket in the same way I check things like headlines or the weather, where you're not trying to deeply understand anything, you're just trying to get a quick sense of what's happening. It wasn't intentional, and I wouldn't have described it as using it as a news source, but in practice that's what it slowly turned into, because I noticed I was opening it before I checked anything else, just to see if anything had shifted. Most of the time, it's uneventful. You open it, scan a few markets, close it again. A list of very specific questions that don't really exist anywhere else because they're too narrow or too conditional, whether a CEO steps down within a certain time frame, whether a policy decision happens before a date that's already close enough to feel real. And then, mixed into that, things that feel almost unserious when you first see them. Markets about whether MrBeast's next video will hit a certain number of views, how many times Elon Musk will tweet this week, stuff that feels closer to scrolling than analysis, and occasionally something that feels completely out of place, like trying to assign a probability to whether Jesus returns within a specific time frame. It's easy to read that as a joke, but the system doesn't really treat it that way. It sits right next to markets about interest rates, policy decisions, timelines that actually affect things in a very material way, and nothing about the interface tells you one matters more than the other. After a while, you stop reacting to that contrast as much as you'd expect. Everything starts to flatten a bit, just different questions, same format, numbers moving. But every once in a while, something shifts in a way that feels slightly out of sync with everything else. And that's usually what keeps you on the page a little longer than you meant to stay. There's no article, no headline, nothing circulating widely enough that you would have seen it somewhere else first. And still, the number starts moving. Not dramatically, just consistently. Up a few points, then a few more. You refresh once, then again, just to check if it was noise. It usually isn't. And if you've seen it happen a few times, you start to notice the order of things feels a bit reversed. The number changes first. The explanation shows up later, sometimes hours later, sometimes the next day, sometimes in a way that makes the earlier movement feel almost obvious in hindsight. At first, I thought of that as the market just being efficient, pulling together public signals faster than I could on my own. And sometimes that explanation still works. But there are moments where it feels slightly ahead of what's publicly visible in a way that's harder to attribute to just better reading of the same information. And that's where the free information idea starts to feel a bit thinner. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete in a way that's harder to ignore once you've noticed it. Because technically, everything is still accessible. You can open the page, watch every change, follow along in real time. Nothing is hidden from you at the interface level. But what's actually driving the movement isn't arriving with it. The structure of platforms like Polymarket or even Kalshi doesn't really distinguish between how someone arrives at their belief. Careful analysis, intuition, proximity, private knowledge, they all enter the system the same way. And once they're inside, they flatten into the same thing. A number that updates. So when you're looking at that number, it's easy to treat it like information because it behaves like it. It tells you something about what might happen, but it's also carrying something else at the same time, which is the timing of who felt confident enough to act on it. And that part doesn't feel evenly distributed, even if the surface does. There's also this other layer that's hard to ignore once you spend enough time with it, which is that interacting with these markets doesn't feel entirely different from gambling, even if the framing is more analytical. You're still looking at uncertainty, trying to interpret signals, deciding whether the current number feels off in some direction. Except here, the odds aren't set in advance. They're shifting based on people who may be seeing the same thing you are, or something slightly earlier, or something you don't have access to at all. And you don't really get to know which one it is. So you end up checking it the same way you check anything else that feels loosely predictive, in the morning, in between things, sometimes before opening the news, just to see if anything already moved. Not out of full trust, more like pattern recognition. You've seen enough moments where the number moved first and everything else followed, that it starts to feel useful in a way that's hard to define cleanly. There's also a legal side to this that doesn't feel fully settled, at least from the outside, because in traditional financial markets there are very clear rules about acting on material non-public information, whereas here the boundaries seem less clearly defined, especially on platforms that don't sit neatly inside existing regulatory frameworks. And even in cases like Kalshi, where there is oversight, the core interaction doesn't really change. You're still not asked where your information comes from, only whether you're willing to act on it. So you end up with this system that's very good at showing when something has already started to shift, even if you don't yet know why. And that changes how the whole idea of free information lands. It still feels true in most situations. You can access almost anything, quickly, without much friction. But that seems to apply more to the part of information that has already settled, already been said, already been made safe enough to circulate. The earlier part, the moment where confidence forms, where something starts moving before it's clearly visible, still feels uneven. Prediction markets don't really hide that, they make it easier to notice. And all you really end up with is the ability to watch that difference play out in real time. If you found yourself checking these markets in a similar way, even casually, I'm curious what they've started to feel like to you over time, because they don't quite behave like news or analysis or gambling, and that in-between state is probably why they're hard to place. And if you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.